The winter of 1940. London is a city holding its breath in the dark. Overhead, the Blitz rages. The sky, once a familiar blanket of stars, is now a terrifying theater of searchlights, anti-aircraft fire, and the relentless drone of the Luftwaffe. Deep beneath the scarred streets, in the belly of the city, life goes on. Hundreds of Londoners huddle together in the relative safety of the underground stations, the rumble of the trains a comforting counterpoint to the thunder above. Among them, in the bustling South Kensington station, is a 40-year-old man named Gilbert Roberts. He's a former Home Guard member, a military man through and through, but tonight he's just another face in the crowd, seeking shelter from the storm of steel raining down on his home. Christmas has been canceled on the streets above. Any twinkling light, any festive display, is seen as a potential bullseye for a German bomber. But down here, in the subterranean gloom, there's a small act of defiance. A dozen little decorated fir trees line the platform, a fragile symbol of hope in a world torn apart by war. As Robert stands admiring them, he notices another man, also looking up the trees. He's dressed in plain clothes, wearing a simple cap, carrying a stick. There's something familiar about him. After a moment, the stranger approaches the uniformed Roberts. He asks politely if Roberts would mind accompanying him back to ground level. In that instant, the blood drains from Gilbert Roberts' face. He realizes who he's talking to. As they ascend the stairs, the whispers start. People recognize the man in the cap. There are no cheers, no loud applause, just a quiet, profound respect. As Roberts later wrote, they bowed as he climbed up the middle row of stairs, saying, "Happy Christmas, Your Majesty." Outside, on the cold, dark street, King George VI shakes Gilbert Roberts' hand, climbs into a modest gray Hillman car, and drives off into the night. It was an extraordinary, surreal encounter, a moment of quiet dignity amidst the chaos of war. But for Gilbert Roberts, it would not be his last meeting with the king. And the next time their paths crossed, the fate of the entire nation would hang in the balance. Because this unassuming man, sheltering in a tube station, was about to become the mastermind of one of the most audacious and critical operations of the Second World War. And with the help of a team of unlikely heroes, he was about to rescue Britain from the brink of starvation and surrender. Music swells, then transitions to a more ominous, suspenseful tone. To understand the scale of the task facing him, you have to understand the terror that was stalking the Atlantic Ocean in 1941. Winston Churchill, a man not easily rattled, would later write that there was one thing and one thing only that truly frightened him during the war. It wasn't the Blitz, it wasn't the threat of invasion. It was, in his words, the U-boat peril. And for good reason. Britain is an island. Its survival, its ability to fight, depended entirely on the convoys of merchant ships that were its lifeline, bringing in food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials from across the world. And out in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic, that lifeline was being systematically severed. German U-boats operating in deadly groups they called wolf packs were hunting with devastating efficiency. They were ghosts of the deep, striking without warning, sending countless ships and their vital cargo to the bottom of the ocean. Imagine the scene at the Admiralty in London. On a wall, a giant chart of the Atlantic. With each passing day, more pins are added, each one marking another ship lost. That chart wasn't just a map. It was, as one officer described it, like a calendar outlining the schedule of a death sentence. The numbers were staggering, and they were getting worse. Throughout 1941, the losses climbed. From 2.5 million tons of shipping sunk in January to an average of 4 million tons a month by the autumn. 4 million tons of food, fuel, and supplies gone, every single month. The effect back home was immediate and severe. Britain was being starved into submission. One by one, essential goods began to disappear from the shelves, replaced by the grim reality of the ration book. Meat, tea, jam, cheese, eggs, milk, all strictly limited. Government scientists worked frantically, creating strange new foods to fill the gaps. Eggs were spray-dried into a powder that took up a fraction of the shipping space. Powders and pastes were invented to mimic the taste of things that had vanished completely, like bananas. On June 1st, 1941, clothing was rationed. A year later, petrol was so scarce, it was available only to official users, like the fire brigade and ambulances. The nation was slowly, inexorably, grinding to a halt. The Royal Navy was fighting back, of course. Escort ships, destroyers, corvettes, frigates were tasked with protecting the convoys, but they were losing, badly. For every U-boat the Allies managed to sink, the wolf packs claimed dozens of merchant vessels. In the first half of 1941, the Allies sank a pitiful 12 U-boats. In January, February, and July of that year, they sank none at all, 0. The problem was, they were fighting blind. They had no coherent set of tactics. The escort ships were woefully unprepared for what they were facing. They were like boxers flailing in the dark against a swift, invisible, and deadly opponent. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, and if the Atlantic was lost, the war was lost. This was the nightmare that kept Churchill awake at night. He called an emergency meeting. Something had to be done. A new way of thinking was needed. A new weapon. But this weapon wouldn't be a new type of ship or a bigger bomb. It would be a new idea. And the man they chose to find it was the same man who had stood on that tube platform just a year earlier, Captain Gilbert Roberts. Music shifts to a more personal, character-driven theme. So, who was Gilbert Roberts? On the surface, he was the last person you'd pick for a job this critical. He was a brilliant naval officer, yes, a highly experienced navigator and strategist, charismatic, well-liked. He had been a commander with a promising career ahead of him. But that career had been cut brutally short. In 1937, he was invalided out of the Navy after a severe bout of tuberculosis. For a man who lived and breathed the sea, it was a devastating blow. When war broke out in 1939, Roberts was desperate to get back in the fight. He applied for any and every kind of war work he could find. And he was rejected, again and again and again. He was deemed medically unfit for duty, a forgotten man, watching the war from the sidelines while his country fought for its life. Then, one day, out of the blue, the phone rang. It was a summons. Report to the cabinet office, immediately. There, he was given his orders. He was to go to Liverpool, the heart of the battle for the Atlantic. He was to be the head of a new, top-secret department, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU for short. His brief, delivered by Churchill himself, was brutally to the point. Find out what is happening, and sink the U-boats. For Roberts, this was more than just a mission. It was a resurrection, a chance to serve the country that had cast him aside. He was so overwhelmed with excitement, so desperate to prove himself, that he almost missed his train to Liverpool. He arrived in the city in the dead of night, January 2nd, 1942. The docks were humming with the grim business of war. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of the sea. And in Roberts' mind, an idea was already starting to form. The next morning, he met his new commanding officer, Admiral Sir Percy Noble, the commander-in-chief of the Western Approaches. Noble was a formidable, old-school Navy man. Roberts laid out his plan. It was unconventional. He proposed to create a kind of game, a massive, real-life war game that would simulate the battles raging in the Atlantic. He wanted to recreate the Wolfpack attacks, to understand exactly how the U-boats were succeeding where the Royal Navy was failing. By playing the game over and over, they could develop and test new counter-tactics. It would be something like a giant, high-stakes version of the board game Battleships or Risk. This game, he explained, would then become the core of a new training center for naval officers. Sir Percy Noble listened, and he was not impressed. Roberts later recalled his new boss's dismissive response. "Well," Noble said, with an air of disdain, "you can carry on, but don't bother me with it." It was a stinging rebuke, a clear signal that he was on his own. Stung, but undeterred, Roberts returned to his new office. It was a large, empty room in a building called Derby House, right next to Liverpool's town hall. This room would be his home, his laboratory, and his battlefield for the rest of the war. With no official support, he got to work. Using the polished linoleum floor as his giant game board, he took pieces of chalk and long lengths of string and began to lay out the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. he designed a team game. One team would play the role of the escort ship commanders, trying to protect their convoy. The other team, they would become the enemy. They would think like U-boat captains, hunt like the wolf packs. To make the game as realistic as possible, it would be fed with live intelligence. Information from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, reports from ships at sea, known and suspected locations of enemy submarines, it would all be fed into the game in real time. The teams would then take turns, making their moves, fighting their phantom battle right here on the floor. The game was ready, but now Roberts faced another problem. Who was going to help him run it? He needed a team. He'd been told he would get former Navy personnel, men like himself who were deemed unfit for active duty. They would be supplemented by volunteers from the recently revived Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. The first arrivals were not promising. To his dismay, the first 2 male colleagues assigned to him proved to be, in his own words, dull of brain. He could only hope the Wrens would be better. He would not be disappointed. Music becomes lighter, more optimistic. By the end of the week, his team had arrived. 4 whip-smart young women were at his side to work as plotters, with 6 more junior Wrens to handle the administrative side of things. And they were nothing like the old guard of the Navy. Most were barely out of their teens. Not a single one of them knew the first thing about military strategy or naval tactics. But they had something far more valuable: boundless enthusiasm, sharp minds, and a fierce determination to do their part. This was the start of one of the most astonishing and unsung collaborations of the war: a forgotten commander still struggling with his health and a small team of inexperienced young women. And together, from this basement in Liverpool, they were about to turn the tide of the Second World War. The Wrens learned at lightning speed. The work was grueling. They worked in 10-hour shifts, providing round-the-clock cover for the game. There was little time for rest and even less for a social life. One of the plotters, a young woman named Mary Hall, recalled, "During these watches, we had time off for meals and a bit of a snooze at night if we were lucky." They spent so much time underground, away from the daylight, that a special sun-ray treatment room was installed in Derby House just to compensate for their lack of sunlight and keep them healthy. As the games got underway, replaying recent disastrous convoy battles, a question began to form in Gilbert Roberts' mind, a nagging inconsistency that nobody else seemed to have noticed. The official Navy doctrine, the assumption that underpinned every tactic they had, was that U-boats always attacked from outside the convoy. They would fire their torpedoes from a safe distance, lurking in the darkness beyond the outer screen of escort ships. But a recent attack just didn't fit that pattern. A merchant vessel, right at the very heart of a convoy, had been sunk. How was that possible? How could a torpedo travel through the entire formation of ships to hit a target in the middle without anyone seeing it? It didn't make sense. Could it be? Could the entire British strategy be based on a completely false assumption? This was the kind of radical question that the top brass at the Admiralty, with their rigid thinking, would never have asked. But here, in this experimental games room, free from the shackles of tradition, everything was on the table. What if, Roberts wondered, the U-boats weren't attacking from the outside at all? What if they had attacked from deep inside the columns of the convoy? And if so, how on earth did they get there? Music shifts to a puzzle-solving or detective theme, building suspense. It was late at night. The city was quiet, but in Derby House, the lights were still on. Roberts was buzzing with a new, urgent energy. He asked 2 of the Wrens if they would stay behind after their shift. Their names were Jean Laidlaw, who was 21, and Janet Oakle, who was just 19. He explained his new, wild theory. Infused with his excitement, the 2 young women immediately agreed. They cleared the floor and hastily set up the game board again. This wasn't just another simulation. This was a detective story. They were hunting for a ghost. They plotted different scenarios, trying every possibility that might have allowed a U-boat to sneak into a heavily guarded convoy completely undetected. They tried attacks from the front, from the sides. Nothing worked. The escort ships would have seen them. And then they had their breakthrough. Their conclusion was as simple as it was terrifying. The U-boats weren't coming from the front or the sides. They were approaching on the surface, at night, from the rear of the convoy. It was the convoy's blind spot. Lookouts were focused on the threats ahead, not behind. Under the cover of darkness, a surfaced U-boat was small, low in the water, and incredibly difficult to spot. It could move much faster on the surface than it could submerged. So, the U-boat would simply motor up behind the convoy, slip between the columns of slow-moving merchant ships, pick its target, fire a torpedo at point-blank range, and then dive. It would crash dive deep beneath the waves as chaos erupted on the surface. And then it would simply wait. It would sit silently on the seabed as the entire convoy and its furious, confused escorts passed safely overhead. Once the coast was clear, it would surface and slip away. It was brilliant, it was audacious, and it was deadly. A wave of excitement washed over the small group in the room. They hadn't just solved the puzzle, they had gotten inside the enemy's head. But knowing how the U-boats were attacking was only half the battle. Now they needed a way to stop them. They took a short break for a late-night supper of corned beef sandwiches and coffee, the fuel of late-night genius. Then Jean and Janet were back on their hands and knees on the floor. They began working on a counter-strategy, a new dance of death. The standard Navy procedure when a U-boat was detected was for the nearest escort ship to peel away from the convoy and chase it, firing depth charges in a direction away from the precious merchant vessels. It was designed to push the threat outwards. But now they knew the threat wasn't outwards, it was inwards. Roberts' new system completely upended decades of military thinking. In their new scenario, when a ship in the convoy was hit, the escort ships didn't turn away, they turned in. While the main convoy steamed ahead, continuing on its course, the escort ships would remain behind. They would perform a coordinated sweep of the very water the convoy had just passed over, like a net being drawn through the sea. They would use their sonar, their ASDIC, to listen for the U-boat lurking silently below. And when they found it, they would drop their depth charges, not into the empty ocean, but right on top of their trapped and terrified prey. There would be no escape. They replayed the scenario again and again and again. It was flawless. "I couldn't pick a hole in it anywhere," Roberts wrote in his diary that night. He sent an urgent message. He needed to see Sir Percy Noble as soon as possible. Music builds to a climax. The next day, Admiral Noble, flanked by his senior staff, entered the games room. The old-school naval men looked down warily at the floor, with its strange markings of chalk and jumbled lengths of string. You could almost hear them thinking, how could this man, this invalid, with his eccentric game and his team of schoolgirls, possibly contribute anything to the real life-and-death battles being waged at sea? Undeterred, Roberts began to explain. He laid out their theory step by step. Then he gestured to Jean and Janet. The demonstration began. With small wooden models, the two young women played out the scene. The U-boat sneaking in from the rear, the torpedo strike, the chaos, and then the new counterattack. The escorts turning inwards, the coordinated sweep, the inevitable kill. As they played, something remarkable happened. Admiral Noble's demeanor began to change. The skepticism on the faces of his staff melted away, replaced by a focused intensity. As Roberts later reported, they seemed to sit forward on their chairs. They were witnessing the birth of a revolution in naval warfare. When the demonstration ended, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then, Admiral Noble spoke. He had only one word for Roberts and his team. Congratulations. The commander-in-chief, the man who had told Roberts not to bother him, turned to one of his aides. "Take down a message," he ordered, "to be sent post-haste to the Prime Minister." He began to dictate. "The first investigations have shown a cardinal error in U-boat tactics. A new, immediate, and concerted counterattack will be signaled to the fleet within 24 hours. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. An air of friendship, Roberts noted, had finally arrived. Noble now asked for a name for this brilliant new tactic. Roberts explained that Jean Laidlaw, the 21-year-old who had done all the painstaking statistical work, had already christened it. She called it Raspberry. Why Raspberry? Because, she reasoned, it was a raz of contempt. A raspberry blown in the face of Hitler and his supposedly invincible U-boats. Admiral Noble chuckled. As he was about to leave, he paused, turned back to Gilbert Roberts, and gave one final order. "Sew on your fourth stripe," he said. Commander Roberts was now Captain Roberts. Triumphant music. Operation Raspberry was an immediate, game-changing success. Just weeks after its implementation across the fleet, Allied escort ships sank 4 times as many German U-boats as they had in the entire previous month. It was an astonishing reversal of fortune, and that upward trend would continue for the rest of the year. The little team in Derby House didn't stop there. They would go on to develop a whole suite of tactics, giving them equally irreverent names: gooseberry, pineapple, strawberry, artichoke. Unlike raspberry, which was a counterattack, many of these new maneuvers were offensive, giving escort ships the tactics they needed to actively hunt U-boats before they could even launch an attack. The wargame in Derby House was no longer a fringe experiment. It was now the beating heart of Britain's anti-submarine strategy. In February 1942, the first group of naval officers, arriving fresh from the brutal reality of the Atlantic, began their week-long training course on Roberts's linoleum floor. They learned to fight the war in a whole new way. As news of WATU's success spread, the unit began to attract high-profile visitors. In November, the King and Queen themselves came to visit. The Wrens were, as Roberts recalled, all of a twitter. Despite the pressure of the royal audience, they performed their raspberry maneuver to perfection. Afterwards, the king, who immediately recognized Roberts from their chance meeting in the tube station 2 years earlier, pulled him aside. He asked about his health and gently admonished him for getting too thin. By this stage, Roberts weighed little more than 8 stone, or about 112 pounds. Finally, King George gestured at the floor, still littered with the remnants of the game. He leaned in close to Roberts. "This," he said, his voice filled with conviction, "this is the key to the Battle of the Atlantic." By the end of 1942, as many as 200 naval officers a month were playing the game. The trainees were a diverse bunch. There was the famous ornithologist Peter Scott, who one of the Wrens remembered for constantly drawing ducks all over his navigational charts. And there was a dashing young officer from the Greek royal family, a young Prince Philip, the future husband of Queen Elizabeth. His presence, one Wren recalled, brought the team unending delight. Another trainee was the writer Nicholas Montserrat. His experience at WATU clearly left a deep impression. He would later immortalize it in his classic 1951 novel, The Cruel Sea, which described a convoy game played out with model ships on the floor of an empty room. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic finally came in May 1943. After a week of bitter, ferocious fighting, and following devastating losses on both sides, the German U-boat chief, Admiral Karl Donitz, made a fateful decision. He withdrew his remaining submarines from the North Atlantic. The wolf packs had been beaten. The lifeline was secure. The battle, which Churchill had feared most, was won. And it was won not just by brave sailors at sea, but by a handful of brilliant minds in a basement in Liverpool. It was a triumph of strategic brilliance, a victory of intellect and ingenuity against overwhelming odds. You would expect, then, that Gilbert Roberts and his team of remarkable women would be celebrated as national heroes. But for Roberts, there was to be no formal recognition. The quiet, dedicated work of WATU remained a closely guarded secret. Years passed. The war ended. Life returned to normal. Then, on January 4th, 1965, a letter arrived for Roberts. It was official. It informed him that he was to receive a knighthood, Sir Gilbert Roberts. It was the vindication he had waited for his entire life, a gesture that finally recognized his work and perhaps erased the scar he still carried from his dismissal from the Navy all those years ago. But the very next day, the phone rang. The caller explained that there had been a mistake. The letter had been sent in error. The invitation was retracted. No knighthood, no explanation, just a cold, bureaucratic cruelty. Why didn't they just let him have it anyway? His daughter, Susan, later asked. Why indeed? It was a final, bitter blow. A cruelty, she said, from which her father never truly recovered. Captain Gilbert Roberts died in January 1986, feeling that his pivotal role in the fight against the Nazi threat had never been fully or properly recognized. And the women? The brilliant, dedicated Wrens who had worked by his side?
They received no official accolade at all. Their contribution was simply erased from the official history. They were bound by the Official Secrets Act, forbidden to talk about their work for 50 years. Many of the surviving Wrens have described how they never even told their own husbands what they had really done during the war. To their families, they were just secretaries or administrators, not the strategic masterminds who had outthought the German High Command. And yet, for many of them, there were other, more personal rewards.
It gave me my first taste of freedom, one of them later wrote. Before the Wrens, I'd had to account for everything, where I was going, who with, and what time I'd be home. You didn't really think about it until you had the chance to be freer. For these young women, their secret work wasn't just a contribution to the war effort, it was a quiet revolution in their own lives. Only now, decades later, following the release of classified archive material and through the memories of the remarkable women who were there, can the story finally be told. Only now can Britain's debt to these unsung heroines and to their brilliant, forgotten leader Gilbert Roberts be finally and fully acknowledged. They were the secret weapon that won the secret war.